This is a time of the year where the memories of our past, our childhood, come to the forefront of our minds, and we think of all the wonderful warm feelings that surround Christmas. I suppose we need that kind of memory, seeing that the weather is cold, and anything that'll warm us up is good. Now, my memory of Christmas is probably very different to most of you all's memory, because in the southern hemisphere it's summer. So we'd watch TV of snow falling and we'd be on the beach getting burnt by the sun. Oh, that's warm too, isn't it? So that's good. Everybody's warm in Christmas. I don't know about you, but the passage we're going to look at this morning is probably the most iconic passage and probably the most iconic image we have of Christmas. We think of the 3 wise men who traveled from the east to come and see Jesus. And we have this picture in our mind. We can go to almost any town in a Christian nation and you will find the nativity scene. And I'm sure most of us in here at some point have been a part of some sort of nativity play, haven't we? And we played some character in the play. I always remembered I wanted to be baby Jesus because you didn't have to do a whole lot. You just kind of lie down there. But they never had a crib that was big enough for me at the time, so I had to be something else. I want us to think about this passage because sometimes the story of Jesus is made very simple, and we understand why, and we appreciate what the sentiment of the season is. But there's more to the story than just a fairy tale-like almost story. And that's what we're going to find out this morning. When we think of Jesus, we think of an innocent baby born to loving parents, to being appreciated by everybody that came in contact with him at his birth. And we love that because we see the innocent baby. We see the innocent newborn. The hard thing for us to grasp is the fact that as he grew up, he didn't turn into the terrible twos. He didn't become an angry teenager. He didn't become a reckless young adult. He didn't turn into any of those things, the stages we go through. Jesus was innocent from the day he was born until the day he left this earth. So we can appreciate that part of the story, but this story means a whole lot more than that. I believe looking at this story, we have the proof for who Jesus is, who the real Jesus is. And I believe as we look at this passage, we're going to focus primarily on verse 1 and verse 2. But if you want to follow along in your Bible, you can read all the way through verse 12 that covers the story as a whole. So starting in verse 1, it says, After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. In just these 2 short verses of the beginning of this story, we get all that we need to understand who Jesus really is. Sometimes, as I said, we try to simplify the story so much that it's just about a baby in a manger. Now we know realistically, probably by the time the Magi reached Jesus, he's probably several months old, perhaps nearing the age of 2. You'll remember from the story, Herod asks, when did the star appear? Because Herod's no dummy, he would know that once the star appeared, it would be the sign that Jesus was born. Now, I don't know how long these guys had been traveling and when they started their departure as they headed west to find this child. But it must have taken at least a few weeks, maybe months to get there. I don't know what kind of caravan they were in. We know that there were at least 3 gifts, but we are uncertain as to how many wise men there were. The truth is about this passage, this was a very uncomfortable passage for the early church. Those who misunderstood the story completely missed the whole point of the story, because they focused on all that was bad about the story. And we do the same today. The uncomfortableness about the story is that the Magi were astrologers. Now, that's different to astronomy. The interesting thing is that the star that is spoken about here comes from the word aster, and that is from a variation of the word astronomy, which means star. And that's where we get astronomy from. But these guys were not astronomers. They were not necessarily pure scientists, even though astronomy was probably the first science. See, they were astrologers. They saw signs in the stars. And this was very uncomfortable for the early church, because those kinds of people were prohibited. Anybody that delved into those kinds of studies were prohibited from worshiping the Savior. And yet here we find them seeing the point at which the child was born. And of course, we know from the story that they come to Herod and they announce that they are coming to find the King of the Jews. They knew exactly who they were looking for. And it's funny that they didn't think about what this could do. I suppose they anticipated that when they got to Jerusalem, that everybody would be so excited to hear about this king that is born. But we know from the story it says that everybody in Jerusalem was alarmed, just as Herod was alarmed. It doesn't take much history, much study, to find out that Herod was a very evil man. And he was a puppet king set up by the Romans, so there was a lot of politics involved. And you had to realize that this was not going to end well. This was a terrible thing to do, for the Magi to show up at the king's palace and say, hey, we found another king that's going to replace you. Herod would not stand for that. And of course, he plays true to his character. Remember, it says he secretly went to them. He didn't want anybody else to know, because he was very careful in how he moved. And he said to them, when you find him, come and tell me, so I can also go and worship him. Now, of course, that was not what Herod wanted to do, because we know later that Herod went out and killed every child in the vicinity that was 2 years or younger. He wanted to make sure that he got rid of this rival king. Now, I don't think he really understood what they were saying. They came to worship the king. Well, you don't worship kings. You only worship God. So Herod misunderstood completely from the very beginning what the Magi were trying to do. The Magi were people who shouldn't have known these facts. The Magi were people that shouldn't have wanted to worship Jesus. See, because they were scientists, and they studied the stars. But I wonder, as I looked up into the sky, a new star appears. Now, according to all that they know, all that science relies on, there are no new stars. They just don't show up in the sky. And then against all that is scientific, stars don't move through the sky. And then all that science tells us, stars don't just stop in the sky and suspend themselves. And then when the Magi are ready to move on, the star moves again. No stars do that. They knew there was something about this star. And they followed it all the way to Jerusalem. Now, I don't know if they knew exactly where the place was, because we know from the story that Herod wanted to find out where the Messiah was going to be born. Where this king that everybody was waiting for was going to be born. It's interesting that we could look back into the past to find out what's going to happen in the future. Isn't that interesting? Even they knew that. They go back and they pull out all the old texts. And they look around, they find all these passages, and they realize, wait a minute, the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. Now, it's interesting, Herod is really crafty, because Herod could have sent an army down there and found Jesus and killed him. Herod is sneaky. And so he devises this plan. You'll remember from the story, though, the angel comes to them in a dream and says, you can't trust Herod. So much so that you can't even go back to Jerusalem. You have to go back to your home country a different way. I think the Magi realized that not all of Israel was waiting for Jesus. Not all of Jerusalem was happy to hear that the king had been born. The truth is, their very lives depended on them listening to what the angels had told them. Now, this is not the warm and fuzzy story we know about Jesus. This is not the baby in the manger. This is not the innocent little child that Mary is holding, that everybody is just falling over, even though that's a wonderful image. It's sad that even in Jesus' birth, you have all this intrigue. You have all this sin and evil that is taking place. So much so that in the story, you remember, the angel comes to Joseph in a dream and says, yep, you guys are in danger too. Take the child and go to Egypt until we tell you to come back. Now, we don't often think about it, but in the story, these gifts that the Magi bring to Jesus are vitally important. You see, because what is going to pay for their trip all the way to Egypt? What is going to support them in Egypt for possibly a few months, at least, until Herod dies? What is going to allow them to return back to Israel and to start their life back up again? Well, all of these gifts are going to allow them to do that. It's interesting how God made sure that his son was not only protected by the angels, but that he was taken care of by a great mother and father, and that the people around him that protected him and supported him were able to get him through these early stages of his life. Now, from the story, we know that there are many things about Satan that he cannot do. You see, because Satan, more so than anybody else, would have loved to have destroyed Jesus. He tried through Herod. And Herod used every possible scheme and plan that he could to be able to get to Jesus, but he just could not get it. You see, the same is true today. We know, because of this story, that Satan is limited in many ways. Because if he wouldn't have and couldn't go after Jesus, he can't do the same for us. But he certainly tried. When we think of the story of Jesus' birth and the first few months of his young life, we realize that they were very dangerous times. The best time to stop a giant sequoia from growing to several hundred feet high is to destroy the seed while it's in the ground. Because once that thing gets up to 300-400 feet, it's a whole lot harder to bring it down. It's a whole lot harder to hide what you've done. It's a whole lot harder to get rid of the evidence. So you snuff it out at the very beginning. It's a whole lot harder to deal with Jesus when he's on the cross, lifted up high where everybody can see him and nobody can ignore it. And the history can tell the story. You try to take care of it before it gets there. But Satan was unable. So why do we have this story? What is it about this story that is so important? It's not just the warm, fuzzy story we have. It's not just a nativity scene. It's not just all that is good, but we have a good view of how humans are, how people think, what they would do in this life. So what did the Magi's visit to Jesus confirm for us? What does it tell us about Jesus coming to the earth? What do we need to know about this particular part of the story? First of all, the Magi came from the east. Why weren't there people from all over the world coming here? Why did they come from the east? I did a few studies on different words, and one of the other words I looked at was the word east. It's the word Anatole. You stayed at the Anatole Hotel, you stayed at the Eastern Hotel. But why the east? The east is very important. From the passage it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. What's in the east? What is the connection between the east and Israel? Well, if we go back and we look at the past, as they did in Jesus' time, we find out that there's a connection between the east and Israel. When were the Israelites in the east? Well, we know from history that the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon. And during that activity, there were several interesting characters, one of which was Daniel. And we have a book of his. In a couple of chapters in Daniel, we have the story, you'll remember, of the statue. The statue that had gold and silver and bronze and steel. And Daniel tries to explain to us what the future holds. These people could have gone back and looked at it and understood what was going on. But you see, the Magi were living the statue. They were watching the statue form before their very eyes, and they knew when the time was. There's also the chapter in Daniel that speaks of the weeks. The 70 times 7, 490 years. You know what's interesting? If you do the math, you find the right time in the time of Daniel, and you go 490 years, you come right up on the time of the Savior being born. You see, they had an idea of the timing because Daniel had been given the secret of when the Christ would come. Now, it's interesting that the people in the east were paying more attention than the people in Israel themselves. Shouldn't they have known? We know that there were some that knew. If you go to the story in Luke, we know that there were some that were prepared. They were ready. They knew something was up. That particular time period, something fantastic, something great was going to happen concerning the Holy One, the Anointed One, the Messiah, the King of Kings. So from Daniel we find the timing in the coming of Jesus. You see, because they noticed right away, as soon as that star appeared, they were like, that must be the sign. You see, because, people who study astrology, they look at the stars for signs, don't they? Almost every time you buy a newspaper, you can go at some point and find a reading for your day or for the week, right? That's astrology. That's what these guys were doing. They were looking for signs in the stars of what would happen. Can you imagine when those guys were sitting down and they were looking at all their chart trying to figure out where that star came from? They must have sat there thinking, can you believe it, that we are the ones that have been chosen to take this journey? Could you imagine how many generations that is? From Daniel to Jesus. 500 years. For 500 years, the Magi in the east looked to the stars and were paying attention. And the day came. Now we know that they didn't just get up and go. We know that they packed all of these treasures that they brought along with them, because they knew who they were going to see. Now back in those days when they made these trips, they didn't just jump on a bunch of horses or maybe the camels as we see. They had to have an entourage of people going with them. There had to be animals to be taken along to be eaten. There had to be other servants to be able to prepare, to set up tents, to break down tents. There had to be soldiers to protect them, because they weren't just carrying the Magi, but they were carrying all of this treasure. People would want to attack them and kill them and take what they had. I can't imagine how big the entourage was that showed up to the house. Remember, it's not the manger anymore. It's the house in the story where Joseph and Mary were and where Jesus was being raised. Maybe 100 people, maybe more. the Magi knew the timing. They knew they had to get there. They knew when the star appeared, and they knew that it would take them a while to get there. Second, we can see that the Magi noticed that it was his star. It wasn't just a star. Because of the significance of its appearing, because of the timing of the prophecies, there was something special about that star. I don't know where that star is today. Many have tried to figure out how it happened. There are all kinds of theories as to how that star came about. Some have suggested that it is a conglomerate of stars that aligned in the sky. And it would appear that they moved and then stopped and then moved and then stopped. Could be that. Some have suggested that it was just a light, a divine light, that appeared like a star in the sky. And God moved it as He needed to move it. Whichever way we look at it, for thousands of years, this never happened again. And I would venture to say that it would never happen in the future. You see, in astronomy terms, that is amazing because it's a once in a forever possibility. It's not 1 in a million. It's 1 in eternity, just like Jesus is. 1 in eternity. The interesting also is that if it is a star, it's obviously a sun. A star is a sun in astronomy terms, S-U-N. And it's funny that it's the S-O-N that we're more concerned about rather than the S-U-N. As I said earlier, the word star there is the word astera. But it's also comes from the word astronomy, where we get the word astronomy from. From the passage we read, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." It's amazing the timing of the star. And yet because of its timing and its location, these men knew it wasn't just a star. It was the star. And it was pointing to one person, and therefore the star was his. Because of the moving star, the Magi recognized where Jesus would be born. I'm sure they didn't know exactly. The timing is not exact. It's hard to predict that for those 490 years. When does it count? Does it count when Daniel first mentions it? Because obviously Daniel spoke about it first, then he wrote it down. Or was it when Daniel first said it? Or was it when he first wrote it down? Or was it when it was first read by somebody? You see, we don't know. All that gives us a range of years. And then at the end, does the 490 years fall exactly on the day of his birth? Or does it fall on the day of his ministry 30 years later? Or does it fall on the day of his death and resurrection? Those can move around. You see, even these guys didn't have the exact date because that's not the way God works. God is looking for people like the Magi to have the faith necessary to wait on God, to look for God, to see the signs, and to anticipate something happening. This is exactly the way God would work. He gives us enough information to start us to move in His direction. Just like we have today. We don't know everything about the whole world. We don't know everything about eternity. But we know enough. We know enough to move in His direction. These men knew enough to get started. They saw the star going west, and they were like, okay, this has got to be it. The timing, the appearing, and now the movement must be pointing us towards the King of the Jews. So the Magi came to worship Jesus. As I said earlier, worship here is not just showing respect to a king. This is showing respect to the King of Kings. You see, if the Magi had come to Jerusalem, they would have worshipped Herod. But they were not there to worship Herod. They were there to worship somebody far greater than him. Now, is the child king greater than the adult king? No. Logic tells us that. But there's something different about Jesus. He's not like a human king. He's not from here. You see, in their minds, Jesus is from the stars. Well, the truth is, they fell a little short. Jesus is from way beyond the stars. He's not from this heaven. He's not from the heaven beyond. He's from way beyond that. It says, we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. The interesting thing is, because the star stopped, the Magi got confirmation who Jesus was. You see, the star could have kept moving and then just disappeared. It's possible that it was a comet. Scientists tell us that just the timing of it wouldn't allow it. The nearest comet that came by at that time was around 11 BC. Jesus, they believe, was born around 6 or 5 BC. Our dates are a little bit off. Herod dies around 4 BC, so that puts Jesus close to 2 years old. That's why we have that timing, not just from the biblical record, but also from the historic record. But we also have an idea from the astrology, from the astronomy of the record. Couldn't have been a comet. It had to have been the star. This confirmed who Jesus was in their minds. And it should confirm for us today. Why would people from another country, from a different religion, that really had no connection to Israel except through Daniel, why would this be so important to them? Well, everything about this story is important. That star came and went, and it will never return. That star was his star. He came and he went. He will never come back to this earth. We'll see him in the sky someday, but he'll never return to the earth again. Within this human intrigue, within all of the deception, all the politics of the day, within all the fear of the people of what this would do to the Israelite nation, is the true story of Jesus. The young people today started off out of Luke chapter 2. In Luke chapter 2, you have a very different story. You have the angels coming to the shepherds in the field. This is right at the very beginning when Jesus is born. And you'll remember from that story, they were excited to hear. And the angels said this is going to be a good thing for the world. You see, humans will look at this story and they'll say this is a bad thing for the world. But God looks at the story and he says this is a good thing for the world. Makes a huge difference as to how we look at the story of Jesus. Today it's a sad thing to hear in human terms how people describe Christianity, how people describe Jesus, and what their description is of his message and his purpose in coming. There are some today that even go so far as to say that all of the problems in the world are because of Christianity. Just last night I was watching a show on Christopher Columbus. And in one scene, a missionary from Spain has a necklace in his hand. And in the necklace is the cross of Jesus. And he hands this necklace to this Indian child. And the narrator speaks of the evil that is about to come, that will be inflicted on mankind because of that cross. But you see, that's the way the world looks at the story. That's not the way Jesus sees it. That's not the way God intended it. So this story is really important. It was really important that God began things this way, in a humble way, and that he showed us so much about the spiritual world. and yet at the same time we learn so much about our own nature. I could almost see it. We can imagine it. That someday in the future, Jesus will come back in the sky and he will start calling us home. And I just wonder what the excuses of the human race are going to be. I wonder how they would spin it, how they would change it. But you see, it's because of this story that for us it's going to be very different. Because of what the Magi did. They shouldn't have had the connection. They shouldn't have had the faith, but they did. They knew enough to know something special was happening. The Magi knew the when, the where, and the why. They knew enough to know something special was going to happen. If we look at the story is not just that cute story about the beginning of Jesus on this earth. It's a very important story. It brings into account facts that we have to accept as real, as true. There's not a lot of them, but there are enough facts in this story to tell us that Jesus is the Messiah, that he has come, and that as the story begins to unfold, we can believe who he is. I encourage you to think about that as you go into this week, as people are talking about Jesus, that you can share with them the real Jesus. That you can show them these kinds of stories and reveal to them what the mindset of the human is when it comes to perfection, to innocence, to the truth. We are afraid of it, just as they were. When they first heard of the birth of Jesus, Jerusalem shuddered to think of what might happen. The world today shudders when it thinks of what might happen. But if we look at this story, we understand that there's more to it than that. We are not in fear of this story. In fact, we wait, we long for the Son, S-O-N, not S-U-N, to return. And this is a story the world must hear. This is the story we must tell. We have enough evidence to convince people. And hopefully they will listen. And they'll anticipate the coming of the Son. We have a song that's prepared at this time. If you need anything, we want to help you. You've been studying and you know what it means to become a Christian. You are prepared to give your life to Jesus today. This is your opportunity right now as we stand and as we sing.